Time now for the press preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour or so, we'll be taking a look at what's making the headlines with the Sunday Mirror's assistant editor, Laura Armstrong, and the executive director of the Youth Endowment Fund, John Yates. We will be with you guys in just a second, but first let's run the audience through what front pages we have. I think we've got pretty much all of them at the moment. And let's start with the Observer. The attack by Hamas militants on Israel and the retaliation against Gaza is their lead story, their headline. Hundreds die and hostages held as Hamas assault shocks Israel. Indeed, such was the shock at the speed and suddenness of the attack that the Telegraph calls it Israel's 9/11 moment. The taking of civilian hostages by Hamas, which is, of course, against international law, is described in the Sunday Express with this headline, Human Shield Horror. The Sunday Times describes how hostages were physically dragged from their homes by men with Kalashnikovs in scenes ripped from nightmares. Here's the Mail. It concentrates on a picture of one terrified Israeli woman being seized by Hamas gunmen. Their headline, Don't Kill Me. The People report on what is said to be a £1.5 billion plan by Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer to rescue the NHS from crisis if he wins the next general election. After news of an alleged plot to kidnap and murder TV presenter Holly Willoughby, the Sunday Mirror says that she and her former This Morning co-host, Philip Schofield, have resolved their personal differences. And The Sun on Sunday has seen High Court papers in which the former Britain's Got Talent judge, David Walliams, claims that being sacked from the show made him feel suicidal. What of the Star on Sunday? Well, it tells us that a house in Los Angeles bought by Star Trek actor Sir Patrick Stewart is supposedly haunted. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers whilst watching us. But just a reminder, we are, of course, joined this evening by Laura Armstrong and John Yates. Good to see both of you, and a lot to get through. So we'll start with the front of the Observer. Their headline, Hundreds die and hostages held as the Hamas assault shocks Israel. I mean, Laura, this is a brutal, bloody situation. And I think the only thing that any of us can say with certainty is it is going to continue to be brutal and bloody.
Absolutely. I mean, this has shocked everybody since first thing this morning at dawn when the rockets began to rain down on Israeli territory from Gaza. And there's much footage of people horrified in the streets, not knowing what was going on, air raid sirens, big black plumes of smoke. And then after that, we had footage of the Hamas storming down the barricades, coming through in diggers and storming through into that territory and wandering the streets and attacking people seemingly at random. And I think, as you've raised there, like, the shock of this is that everybody was completely blindsided by this. No one saw it happening, and that's extraordinary if you think of the quality of intelligence that the Israelis are known for.
I mean, the scale of the assault is the thing that first grabbed me, John. What about you?
I agree, and I think that what's happening with this, with the story, is it's both such a huge geopolitical story, but it's also so personal. What comes across in the papers is just individual stories of just immense shock and horror, and you just can't help. Any of us who have loved ones, the idea of waking up to the sound of rockets being fired, people running into safe houses, people desperately concerned about loved ones, stories of cousins, members of families being kidnapped, and them not knowing where they are.
I mean, and of course, people living in various parts of Israel have become used to the rocket attacks that Hamas have deployed. But again, it is the scale, the fact that thousands of them were fired in a single instance that I think has caught people off guard.
That's right, and I think we're going to see two things start to happen at once now. We're going to see, obviously, a very, very significant escalation of violence here, which I think is going to be horrific over the next week, 2 weeks. But what would any country do when facing this sort of violence? But we're also going to see a colossal blame game being played within Israel. They're known for having one of the most active, most effective intelligence agencies in the world, but they seem not to have seen this coming, which someone is going to need to take the blame for that, whether it's Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, or whether it's the Defence Forces, or whether it's intelligence forces.
I mean, Laura, we have been hearing a few times today from Benjamin Netanyahu, and he has stated explicitly that no stone will be left unturned, that civilians in Gaza should get out. Quite how they do that, I suppose, is a bit of a question in and of itself. But if we take a look at the Sunday Express, whilst he wishes to respond with with brimstone and fury, I mean, the fact that Hamas have taken hundreds of hostages, some soldiers, plenty of them non-combatants, surely that itself will give Benjamin Netanyahu some pause.
It will indeed. I mean, almost immediately after this story began breaking, there was speculation of whether or not it would lead to a ground invasion. And as we've progressed throughout the day, and we've had statements from him which have used very emotive language, very hellfire and brimstone, the phrase "they will pay an immense price" has been used. It becomes very clear that a ground invasion is likely, but that's undoubtedly why Hamas have taken these hostages. It makes it immeasurably more complicated for him to do that.
And if we take a look at the front of the Sunday Telegraph, a similar theme, I suppose, is ongoing, and a striking photo, of course, on their front page. But, John, for them to describe this as the 9/11 moment, I suppose, is just a riff on that which we've been discussing. The fact they didn't see it coming, or if they were given clues via the usual intelligence channels, they weren't acted upon appropriately.
And I think that probably is going to be the lasting resonance of that 9/11 comparison, because Israel lives with threat. It lives in a region where it often experiences attack, unlike the US pre-9/11. But the similarity will be, how did we not know this was happening? And I think we've got to also recognise, and some of the papers pick this up, that Netanyahu is in the middle of a massive political struggle at the moment.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And the question will be, did he take the eye off the ball? Was it that the intelligence knew? Was it that they didn't know? Or was it that they did know and he wasn't listening? And that's going to be, I think, the big question, just as it was post 9/11. But the shock here is going to have a bigger impact, just as 9/11 did, on just Gaza. Yeah. It's going to have an impact on the wider Middle East.
I think it's important to stress as well that it's a multifaceted attack. This isn't just coming from one place. We had the Navy coming out this morning and saying that they were looking into this. We've had paragliders, we've had the rockets themselves, and then we've had the tanks rolling in. The diggers being used to take down the wall. This has clearly taken months and months and months of planning. It's not a snap reaction at all.
Yeah, and more than that, as we take a look at the Mail on Sunday's front page, and again, a rather personal one, and we'll refer directly to it in just a second. But it wasn't just the intelligence failure that this was about to take place. It was the intelligence failure, presumably, that Hamas have been rearming in significant quantities. But you can understand why the Mail have gone with this particular headline. You know, young girl at a music festival, a peace music festival in the south of the country, taken and then seen on video that we assume has been released by Hamas for propaganda purposes, being dragged off to God only knows what.
It's a horrendous thing to contemplate, it really is. And I think that as the day has gone on, we've heard more of these stories of brutality. On the Express as well, they have stories of grandmothers and pensioners, one grandmother on the back of a golf cart. It's been done for maximum impact, it really has. And I think that you do have to, when people, many of the commentators on the Palestinian side are pointing out the vast challenges these people face, but you do have to look at the brutality with which this has been done. And
I think one thing that, as the days go by, that the media is going to have to work out how to do is tell the human story of both sides of this conflict. Because for every... And this story of this Israeli woman who's been kidnapped, who, you know, all our best wishes, of course, and desire for safety for her are at the top of our minds. But we also will need to hear the stories of innocent civilians in Gaza who unavoidably are going to get caught up in this, whatever Israel does here. And I think the tragedy is going to be amongst civilian populations across the sides of both of those borders. And we need to hear those without having to feel that we're not honouring the fact that this has been an appalling terrorist attack. I
mean, that said, I mean, let's have a look at our final paper this half, the Sunday Times front page, again focusing on hostages being dragged from their homes. The tactics that have been deployed by Hamas in this assault, the way in which they have attacked, you know, indiscriminately, the civilian population as well as the non-combatants. I mean, the level of popular support for the Palestinian cause in the wider world, I just wonder what the effect of the past few hours might be on that.
I think there is a great amount of sympathy for them in many quarters. We've heard stories about how Gaza, in some ways, will be considered inhabitable by 2020. They obviously face great challenges, as
And they're switching off the electricity to it as well tonight.
Exactly. But it's very difficult to... Obviously, you cannot have any kind of conflict without these kind of tragedies, but you can have it without people being dragged through the streets in this way. And I think it's very difficult to garner sympathy for that. But the great tragedy of this, I think, really is that there's going to be a huge amount of bloodshed on both sides.
Briefly, John, if you can.
Well, and the other tragedy is we're inches away from Saudi Arabia signing an amazing normalisation agreement with Israel, and this entirely disrupts it. An opportunity for a greater amount of peace in the Middle East might well be missed because of an absolute human tragedy. We'll
reflect on that in the 11 o'clock hour as well. Guys, pause there just for a second and stay where you are. Let's take a look at the story on the front of the Sunday People. We will be discussing it next. Keir Starmer's new plan to fix that struggling National Health Service. All that and more after this. Welcome back to the press preview. Laura and John still here, and we will change tack and, of course, return to Israel-Gaza after in the 11 o'clock hour. But who wants to take us away on this? Page 8 of the Sunday Express. Axing HS2, the leg between Birmingham and Manchester, will cost thousands of jobs. I mean, that's a statement of the obvious, isn't it?
I did wonder whether this was a story. So you sort of... the story's basically saying the government's no longer going to spend £36 billion of taxpayers' money, and as a result, some people will not have jobs in the future that were going to be jobs. I mean, did we not see that coming? I mean, I kind of think that's rather obvious. The jobs that are being talked about here are not jobs that exist at the moment. They're all jobs in the future. I think there's going to be a series of these sort of stories about axing HS2 is a complete disaster stories by some people who make some money out of building HS2.
And by, if there are op-ed pieces from pretty much all of the mayors of the North and the Midlands.
Of course. The thing is, when you get those people in a room, honestly, they'll say the real rail that ought to be being built is the link up between my city and the surrounding towns. It's actually quite hard to find someone who's an absolute advocate for HS2 who doesn't either say, we've got to do it because otherwise doesn't it just prove we can't build things, or we've got to do it because we've spent all this money, which doesn't, to me, sound like very convincing arguments.
Well, I suppose, Laura, and as the article makes clear, and we will be talking in a bit more depth about the Labour conference in just a second, if anyone is waiting for Sir Keir to stand up and say, do you know what, guys, we're going to push ahead with it, they'll be waiting an awfully long time.
They will be waiting an awfully long time. Angela Rayner was on LBC this morning and she was talking about how it's pretty much impossible to turn this train around. The horse has bolted. Once all this land has been sold off, it's over. And I think this is a twist of the knife, really, isn't it? It's going to make people who are already angry about HS2 much angrier and, and give people another boot to lay into Rishi, because it obviously is going to affect growth in that sense. And that was one of his main five. So I think it's just another excuse to give him a kick-in, I think, really.
Well, explain to us then the story on the front of the Sunday People, Laura. That Sir Keir Starmer, of course, buoyed by that by-election victory this week in which a Conservative candidate actually lost their deposit, he's talking about the NHS, which you usually think is pretty safe ground for the Labour Party, but given the kind of the tensions that there have been with some of the unions, I wonder if it is entirely safe for them.
Well, so this is an exclusive interview he's given to the Sunday People and to the Sunday Mirror, talking about how he's going to set aside £1.5 billion to basically try and clear the backlog, the 7.7 million backlog that we've got in waiting lists. It's going to create 2.2 million extra appointments by paying NHS staff overtime to sort of get through this huge backlog. And it obviously comes as well after we had Wes Streeting yesterday talking about how he was going to put 171 million into new CT scans, new MRIs, is clearly outlining, isn't it, that the NHS is going to be a big part of this Labour conference. And what we're being told behind the scenes is that there's going to be 5 major policies unveiled during this, all of which are costed. And this is what Keir Starmer's really going to get stuck into. And I think that there's a sense here that he knows that although he's got to have a fairly safe conference, people want to see a bit more meat on the bones now.
Definitely. And, of course, I mean, we heard a lot of people were talking earlier on today as if, the idea that kids might have to brush their teeth in school was the flagship policy of this Labour conference. It is clearly not going to be. But again, he still needs to keep his tinder dry a little bit, doesn't he, given we don't yet know when the election is going to be. It's certainly not going to be May if I'm a betting man.
Yeah, I think the challenge that Starmer's got is he's trying to say both, look, this government is absolutely failing and public services are falling apart, and I'm going to fix it without spending much more money. Now, that's quite a hard mix to get across, and he's trying to do it here by, he's got this, what sounds like a big number, £1.5 billion. It's not a huge amount of money.
Not when you compare it to the NHS budget.
Right, the NHS budget next year is 156 billion. You know, this is less than, well, it's about 1%. And it's been rising by about 2 or 3% every single year. So I'm not even totally convinced this is extra money compared to what would be happening anyway. He's also, I think, done well in saying, look, this is all costed. He's found a way he's going to get it out of a crackdown on tax breaks. Look, I probably believe the money is there. The challenge is we've just got to keep an eye on that cracking of that extra money through the tax breaks doesn't get promised to multiple different things over the next few months.
But all he has to do, though, let's be fair, is just make sure that the wheels don't fall off the Labour wagon at this conference, keep a bit of party discipline, and he may well think jobs are good.